Hello and welcome to the Happier Marriage Podcast, a podcast for spouses longing to have a happier marriage so they can feel more connected, desired and supported. Now, to start the show, here is your host and Sherpa, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified relationship coach, Kingsley Grant.
More and more, I have been giving thought to this idea of a legacy and leaving a legacy of faith, family, and impact through our business, our careers, through the things that we do. And the more I think about this, the more I think that this is what God would have us to do, because every single one of us have been given certain talents and skills, and we have been given that not just for ourselves, but it is for making an impact and influencing the lives of others all around us. And I believe that is what you're here for. I believe that's why you're listening to this podcast. And today, as I go through this episode number 86 and talking about how to craft a life of faith, family, and impact, I really wanted to share my heart with you because it is something that I believe that had it not been for God's grace, I could have blown this opportunity at an early age, especially as I began to, my wife and I began to build a life together, and we had our children. And then it's how that became, for us, a reality. And I want to share that with you today, right after this.
So, the big question is this. How is it possible that you have a happier marriage when you feel like you've tried everything? Your spouse isn't making an effort. You're exhausted. You feel like giving up. Or there's so much hurt that's taken place between you and your spouse. That is the question, and this podcast will give you the answers.
As I am recording this podcast episode, I'm doing so on the heels of a man that has really made an impact on my life, who recently died. His name is Dan Miller. You may not know his name, may never have heard his name, but I'm going to tell you that this man truly embodied, for me, are one of the few men that I've seen embodied this idea of leaving a legacy of life, of faith, family, and business. You know, one of the things I have shared on this podcast a few times is that's my relationship experiencing my dad when I was growing up as a child. And I mentioned before my dad, who's died now, and he really impacted our lives in a way that, let's put it this way, I prefer that he had done it some other way, but this is our reality. You know, I'm one of 6 children, and we grew up at a time where my dad, he was we would call today a solopreneur. He really never worked for anybody throughout our lives. He always worked for himself. And one of the things he chose to do was to find a way to operate a minibus, right, at the time. And that was to transport people from one city to another. So all that my life growing up, my dad was always hustling. He would get up very early in the morning, and he would come home late in the evenings, at night many times, because he was out working hard. My dad was a very hard worker. And if I would say the legacy he left behind for us is the work ethic legacy, how to work hard, how to be out there. And I think to the extreme, my dad very rarely took time off. My dad would only not work when he's sick or, something happened. He was a very faith-driven man, a Christian, and he was also a pastor. So my dad had to do a bivocational kind of work. He never got paid, basically, because from the ministry, being a pastor, he really got paid through the work he did. He built the church, he pastored the church, and he also operated his own business. He had a little grocery shop I remember that my dad, I would look forward to getting down there sometimes. It was very close to our house on the same property. And it was just really within, I would say, 500 feet, 600 feet from our house. And we would walk down there and my dad would operate that. And sometimes he would have some help. And sometimes we would help him in the grocery store. And at times he was not there, we closed. He would go and get goods, bring that in. And then on the weekends or at times, he would sometimes operate that, as I mentioned before, or have someone who would come in at times and help him in that regards. But my dad was always working. And so as children, we experienced him on the evenings and sometimes on weekends. Not sometimes, on weekends. On weekends, of course, Sunday was church. And my dad had to also preach. So we would get up early Sunday morning. And my dad, the legacy he left for me in that regards was about the importance of prayer, the importance of studying God's word, memorizing scripture, and making certain as a family would pray together and at times talk about the Bible together. At meal times, my dad would make sure that we learn how to pray. We prayed over every meal that we were going to have at our table, would sit down. So that was another legacy that my dad also left for us. And but outside of that, the idea of legacy of a family, where how families would operate and encourage one another and have times of fun and laughter and vacations and those kind of things, that was not there. That was lacking. The legacy of learning how to communicate and tell each other how much we appreciate and love them and would speak life into each other and have my dad be at events that we were at. Like I played soccer. My dad never came to one of my soccer games. My dad was very busy working. He would love the fact that we did good in school. And he would celebrate that because, again, we were, of course, it was like living through him. Him living through us in the area of education. And so when we succeeded and went through the very good schools, my dad would feel proud of us. And so that was as much as far as the family is concerned. The business aspect of the work ethic, for me, because I showed interest in the business area of that as a child growing up, my dad would allow me to at times participate on the weekends, going with him as he operated his minibus. When I got older, he had two now, and then he would allow me with my uncle who drove the bus. I would be the conductor. I would collect the money from the people when they get on the bus and get off the bus. I would be the one who did that. I felt very, he had the confidence in me. He trusted me with that. And he knew that I would really keep my uncle in line and making certain that my uncle loved to drink. I would say he's an alcoholic. He's dead now, of course, too. But he loved to drink. And I would also making certain that my dad could make certain that I kept him from drinking, especially when he operated his minibus. After he left, he'd come home and parked and left. What he does with that is up to him. So the idea of legacy, I would say I did not learn much from my dad. What it meant to leave a legacy in faith, family, and business. Again, in the faith aspect, I think to some degree, there was some legacy there of trusting God. I remember my dad also teaching us about forgiveness. My dad was beaten up by some men who jumped him. I mentioned in the past episode, dragged him out of his minibus and beat him almost in a unconscious manner on the side of the street and left him there bleeding all over. And my dad was brought to the hospital. He had to take some time to recover. And my dad taught us about forgiveness, how to forgive, because my dad told us we need to forgive those people. So I would say the legacy of faith that was instilled in us. But as family and in business, there were some things missing. When I began to have my own children as a husband, as a father, and also someone who pursuing business, I almost failed in the family aspect at an early stage because I was becoming like my dad. In my mind, I was working hard and trying to find a way to make certain that my family were taken care of, and that I did. But in my mind is if I was able to do that, then later on in life, I'll be able to provide and be there for my family. But of course, that's not the case. because the more I did that, the more I wanted to do more, because I felt like I needed to be out there more and more and more. And thank God, I began to meet different people. One of those persons I met was Dan Miller. And Dan Miller, I got into his world, and he was an entrepreneur, a businessman, but a man of faith and family. I began to watch, not from afar, because I had a chance to be coached and mentored by Dan Miller. I was brought into his ecosystem. I read his book, 48 Days to the Work You Love. I listened to his podcast. I had, his programs. I was in a coaching group with him and had phone calls, had him personally coached and mentored me through the time that I was in the program. I still kept in contact with Dan, still was a part of his program for many, many years. And I admired the way that he went about his business, went about the family, and listened to him and saw his daughter and his son and his wife involved, and just the idea of the integration of all of that. I watched that, and I recognized the importance of being able to do all three successfully. I did not think it was possible. But Dan Miller, in the area of faith, he followed the scripture in Matthew 6, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all those things shall be added unto you. He modeled that. He made certain that was a part. And that's when I began to realize it was possible for us to live out our faith even in a secular world. It was possible for us to be bold and courageous in our faith. And I remember through Dan, I met many other successful entrepreneurs who were doing the very same things. And I realized it was possible because Dan's world was filled with those men and women. I was attracted to the men because I saw husbands and dads. I saw these businessmen and saw them living out this very thing. And I knew it was possible. Dan made an impact. Now, unfortunately and sadly, in the end of 2023, Dan Miller was away with his family as he was again building legacy. And Dan, while he was away, he felt this pain in his stomach, and he was different for him. And he said he had to go when he got home to see his doctor. His doctor ran all these tests, and unfortunately, Dan was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And when I heard, I was shocked. I had to go myself and listen to his podcast. And Dan ended 2023. And here was this man, after he was diagnosed, he came on and shared the diagnosis. He shared the inevitable aspect of his life and about him dying. He shared how they only gave him a few more weeks to live. And what he was going to do was going to record his last podcast episode and enter a time where his reflection upon his life and, of course, is put his house in order. And Dan did that. After his recording, I listened to that. I was so sad because here was a man who had such a great future ahead of him and talked constantly about his future. One of the things he would always say with a question is, what does this make possible? What does this, whatever this is in your life, make possible? And I would learn from that. I use that quite a bit in my own work as a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified relationship coach. I got my coaching training through Dan's organization, 48 Days, and got my certification through him. And the skills I was taught and learned and had to do my own coaching as a way of our practicum, so to speak, where he would all have us come back and share. And I know what I had to come back and share about my experiences, and he would guide my coaching skills through that. I had my training, of course, as a licensed marriage and family therapist. And some of those skills we've learned, we call them soft skills, listening skills, questions, ask the right questions in context. I learned through my many years of schooling, but the coaching also made it a bit different, because the difference in the coaching is basically is really taking the person from where they're at to where they want to go and guiding the process, whereas counseling and therapy was more looking at where they're coming from and, all that stuff. And I don't want to take time to talk about that right here, because that's not the essence of this podcast episode. But the idea of becoming a person that leaves a legacy in faith and family and in business, Dan Miller. And sadly, of this recording today, a couple of days ago, I got the sad news that Dan transitioned from this earth to heaven to be with the God he's spoken about. It's sad for all of us, sad for his family as they now grieve the loss of this incredible man. Dan has left a legacy. He's left a mark, because I look in my social media posts of people that I also have thought about and admired as they talk about one after another, both men and women, the impact Dan has had on their lives. That's the way to leave a world. That's the way to live a life well lived. That's the way I believe that we want to die empty. Dan Miller, I believe, died empty. He gave everything he had. I remember watching a social media post where someone had, prior to when Dan was diagnosed with this cancer, and this person mentioned how in a conversation with Dan Miller prior to that, Dan had made this comment that he felt that he'd given everything. It's almost like he was simply saying, you know what God has put me on this earth to do, I believe I have accomplished the work. This past Sunday in church, we heard the phrase, actually, was it church? I'm sorry. I was at a men's meeting, sitting down with some men, and we were talking, and the person who spoke had mentioned these words of Jesus where he said, to hear the words, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And the speaker said something very interesting. He said this. He said, notice that Jesus did not say, well done, thou good and fruitful servant. He made the remark was, and the emphasis was placed on, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And at our table in a group discussion, we were talking about this idea and the contrast where the emphasis was placed on, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And the question came up, what does it mean to be faithful versus fruitful? Are they separate? And I chimed in my conversation at our table that no, they're not separate. But the question is, which one came first? And so many people focus on fruitfulness, meaning they want to see all this fruit. But where I think they've got it wrong is faithfulness first, is the whole idea of chicken and egg, right? Which came first. And I was sharing that God has called us to be faithful, because in the story, Jesus talked about a man who left some of the people he was at his employ with talents. To some he gave 1 talent, another he gave 5, another he gave 10. When he came back and asked about this, how they have put to work what they left, he gave them, and how the 10 doubled it, the 5 doubles theirs, the 1 hid it. And the question was, where was the faithfulness? The faithfulness was in the 5 and 10, because they did not know how much would come as a result of their faithfulness, but the fruitfulness and so happened to be doubled. And Jesus remarked in this story how they were given more because they were faithful in what they were given. Dan Miller was faithful in what he was given. My dad was faithful in what he was given, but I believe my dad missed in some areas because he was so focused on the doing that he missed the part of being a good dad, being a present dad and husband, being present with us. Because at the end of the day, as you know, no one can take with them all the things they worked for. We all leave those things behind. My dad did. Dan Miller has. You will, and I will. The only thing we can take with us is the legacy we left with people, how we influenced people, what we did in helping people to become a better version of themselves. I thank God I have been given the opportunity to do that. And I still have, because I'm here talking to you, this opportunity to continue to help shape lives. And that's why I believe it's so important for us. Like I mentioned when I was at that group, at this men's group, we're going to be there for 7 weeks. We're going to be talking about different buckets, 7 different buckets, and we're going to talk about each week. I believe it's important for you as a man. And if you're listening to this as a wife, you want to encourage your husband to make certain he surround himself with other men who are like-minded. Because if we're going to leave a mark upon our world, and we're going to craft this idea of life of faith, family, and impact, I believe you want your husband to listen to this episode if he has not yet, and challenge him, encouraging him, be his helpmate who can become this person to leave that. Because you say, well, what about me? Well, yes, you too. I believe you're called as well. But as a wife, you're called to do that with your husband and through your husband as the head of the household, as the leader that God has called him to be. And you have come alongside to help him to become the best version of himself. And I believe that with you doing that, and he's seeking God with all his heart, with all his might, with all his soul, and have an alignment and things in order where it is faith, family, and then business. If he has those things in that order, and you help him keep those things in order, I believe that you, sir, you, ma'am, can make this year a very special year. Why not commit to making this the year where the focus is on legacy? You know, and that's why I've put together and I'm forming this idea that I've been toying with. How can we as men? And so I have thought about this idea and have been debating and putting some emphasis on what I call kingdom legacy brotherhood. I believe that we need our other like-minded people. And I want to challenge you to join me in this idea of pushing forward and making this happen. And if you would like to know more, then you can reach out to me. Send me a direct message on a social media platform, whether it's Facebook or Instagram at Kingsley Grant. You can find me there. Or you can send me a message, however you want to reach out to me. But I would suggest social media is very easy. And wherever you're listening to this podcast today, reach out to me on any platform that you're on as a social media of choice. So Kingsley, I'm not on social media. Well, you can send me an email. Send me an email, and I also that will be a great way too. And you can do that by sending me an email to send me an email at staff@kingslegrant.com. staff@kingslegrant.com. But if you're on social media, whether it's on X, formerly known as Twitter, or on Instagram or Facebook or even on YouTube, you could reach out to me and let me know. Okay? Ask this question about kingdom legacy brotherhood. Okay? So my friend, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. And now you're going to hear, as the announcer, we'll have some final message for you. And thank you. May God bless you. Looking forward to seeing you on the next episode of Happier Marriage Secrets, right here on episode number 87. Thank you, and God bless you.
We've come to the end of another exciting show. And if you enjoyed this podcast, 1, make sure you give this show a rating and review. 2, subscribe to the show to get all new releases. And 3, get your complimentary copy of the 5 Secrets to a Happier Marriage ebook at kingsleygrant.com/HMS ebook. Again, it's kingsleygrant.com/HMS ebook. See the link in the show notes. Do it today. Don't delay. Thanks so much for listening, and make sure you tell one other spouse about this show, or better yet, share it with them. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May he turn his face toward you and give you his peace, both now and forever.